Thank you all for joining us for today's CLE, Weathering the Storm, Disaster Preparedness for Pro Bono Attorneys. My name is Leslie Albritton. I'm the Practice Group Manager for Legal Aid of North Carolina's Disaster Relief Project. The goal of our CLE today is to provide training to our volunteer attorneys about how to assist victims of a natural disaster with getting the essential services that they need and the benefits that they need from FEMA. We've divided our presentation today into two sections. The first section will review the process of applying for individual and SBA assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or what we all know as FEMA, and the appeals process if an application for assistance is denied. In the second section, we'll cover lessons learned while working with volunteers in the wake of Hurricane Harvey and discuss common issues victims struggle with, and go over effective communication and advocacy strategies for attorneys working with victims of a natural disaster. And at the end of the program, we will have a question and answer session for the audience to address questions from both of those sections for the presentation. We have two presenters today, and they are Sandra Brown and Manira Mack. Sandra is the Directing Attorney of Disaster Legal Services at Lone Star Legal Aid. She graduated from Tulane University Law School in 1985 and has worked with Lone Star Legal Aid since 1994. She first started responding to disasters after Hurricane Allison in 2001. She became the manager of the Disaster Relief Unit in 2010 and the Directing Attorney of Disaster Legal Services in 2017. She has responded to Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the BP oil spill, the West explosion, the Texas wildfires, the Texas floods of 2015 and 16, and now most recently to Hurricane Harvey. Manira currently serves as the Individual Assistance Lead Attorney with FEMA, Office of Chief Counsel, Response and Recovery Division. In her current position, she's responsible for providing legal advice and support to the Individual Assistance Division, which includes the Individuals and Households Program, Mass Care Division, and the Community Services Branch, which is Disaster Management, Disaster Unemployment Assistance, Crisis Counseling, and Disaster Legal Services. She began her career with FEMA in 2006 as field counsel with her first deployment to support Hurricane Katrina recovery. Thereafter, she transitioned to the FEMA headquarters, where she has provided legal support for numerous disasters, including large-scale recovery operations for Hurricane Sandy and most recently Harvey. Prior to joining FEMA, she was in private practice as a trial attorney with a firm in Philadelphia. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Maryland and her law degree from Temple University. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Manira, who's going to talk to us about the Individuals Assistance Program at FEMA.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I am going to provide a very basic overview of the Individual Assistance Program. And there are several programs within individual assistance. What we're going to be focusing on today, though, is primarily the Individual Assistance and Households Program. So how a disaster survivor starts the process is after a disaster, they will register to receive IA assistance. An applicant can register many ways. The fastest way, I would say, is to go online and do a registration on www.disasterassistance.gov, or you can also download it on your smartphone and apply. I would say that is the fastest way when we're dealing with large-scale events, when our phone systems are inundated with phone registrations. So an applicant can register via phone, and oftentimes that is how they were registered, simply because when there's an event, you may not always have access to the internet to register online. We've made a lot of strides in trying to keep our phone registration as fast as possible, but sometimes our lines do get overwhelmed. For instance, in Harvey, and then we had the back-to-back disasters. We had Harvey, then we had Irma, then we had Maria. So when we have that many events, we have to surge up our call center. Disaster survivors you can also register in person. So after disaster, FEMA will set up a disaster recovery center. We normally call them DRCs, but we will go out in the field in the disaster areas and surrounding areas and actually set up offices. Not only will you find FEMA staff accepting registrations, you will also find our partners in these DRCs, like SBA. Our state partners will also be in these offices. Sometimes you will even find attorneys from disaster legal services. Will allow them access to, in order to facilitate helping the applicant and walking the applicant through the process. Now, after you have a registration and you've gone through that process with registration, I'll just make a quick note. When you register on the phone, you will have to give your social security number, your current mailing address, which is often different from your disaster damaged address. So we will take both addresses so we can contact you. And in addition, you may have to give your telephone number, because what happens at that registration process is we will assign you a FEMA identification number, and that's the number that you're going to use when you call in to our call center to find out about updates, or when you file an appeal, we'll ask for your FEMA registration number. That's the easiest way for us to identify that person. So after the registration, what happens is an inspection is queued up. And that's an inspection of the home, whether it's a home, a single family home, or if there's a renter, if we have to inspect, the apartment where the person's residing. With respect to the inspection process, that's when our inspectors are going to go out, who are contractors, and the applicant will have to provide some proof of ownership or occupancy at that time. If they can't do it at that time, that information can always be submitted later to FEMA. So they'll verify identity by looking at a license or some other photo ID. And they'll look at, whether or not you have a cable bill, something that can demonstrate ownership and occupancy. In terms of ownership, they may show a tax bill, a mortgage statement, or something with the property address. With our renters, they may submit a utility bill, a lease, to confirm that that apartment is their actual primary residence. So the inspector can verify ownership and occupancy at that time. If for whatever reason, because people lose documents in disasters, those things can be provided later. And we have a lot of ways in which we work with applicants in order for them to demonstrate ownership and occupancy. But it is a primary requirement to receive FEMA assistance. Now, we have several types of individual assistance, and all of them have eligibility. Like I said, we're going to talk about the Individual and Households Program, which is really the program that provides money or financial assistance to the applicant. However, just for your point of reference, we do have disaster case management, crisis counseling, disaster unemployment assistance that's actually administered by the Department of Labor. So if an applicant has either lost work or lost wages as a result of a disaster, they can seek unemployment assistance through FEMA, and Department of Labor handles that. And then, of course, we have disaster legal services, where we have the partnership with the ABA Young Lawyers Divisions that provide a lot of legal services. If people have to replace wills, they may navigate, the appeals process. So we have that partnership as well. We have some other programs, and specifically transportation assistance. It's a program we've had since the Post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act. However, we've just implemented it. Our first iteration of that is in Puerto Rico, in terms of providing transportation to applicants to and from their pre-disaster residence when they've had to evacuate and they've left either the island or their location, and they need to return and they don't have a means of returning. And then we have the Cora Brown Fund, which is actually kind of it's a small fund. We had a woman who left her estate to FEMA, and we provide, small amounts, normally $2,000 for unmet needs, and our regional administrators handle that. So a lot of times you may see Cora Brown used when an applicant has additional needs for funeral assistance or something that can't be met through our assistance or other means. Going on to general eligibility criteria. Individual assistance, specifically IHP or the Individuals Households Program, has eligibility criteria for the applicant. So the applicants have to have damage that is caused by the disaster. In addition, the disaster caused need cannot be met through other forms of assistance or insurance. We often refer to that as a duplication of benefits. FEMA cannot provide duplicate assistance with insurance or any other form of assistance the applicant may receive. And we have an obligation not to duplicate assistance, a legal obligation. In addition, your primary residence, this is specifically for housing assistance, and I'll get in that a little bit more detail, but it has to be your primary residence. We do not provide assistance for vacation homes and secondary residences. It must be your primary residence. And the residence must be uninhabitable or inaccessible. So if we have, and I can give you an example of that, your residence may be completely fine and not destroyed, but you can't access to it. So that may be down tree. And in certain circumstances, and sometimes this is dependent upon the factual circumstances of a disaster. So for instance, for Hurricane Sandy, we had there were massive power outages, and you had individuals that may have lived on the 20th floor of a high-rise complex, and they were elderly, and they could not access their home or their apartment simply because there's power outages, and they could not get in that elevator, and you can't expect them to climb 20 flights of steps. So that may make your home inaccessible. So it's not just floodwaters that make your home inaccessible or down trees. There may be other factors that make your home inaccessible, thus making you eligible for FEMA assistance. You also have to, an applicant has to satisfy citizenship eligibility criteria. You have to be a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, national, or qualified alien. The source of that requirement is from the Welfare Reform Act that provides that federal benefits can only be provided to U.S. citizens, non-citizen nationals, or qualified aliens. So with respect to that, when an applicant registers, I will tell you that assistance is provided, and what happens is an applicant signs a declaration in relief, and they will declare that they are a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, national, qualified alien under the penalty of perjury. And we will accept that as that verification. Now, if we later find out that they were not a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, national, or qualified alien, then we may recoup the assistance. We don't hold back assistance based on that. Now, if someone is not a U.S. citizen, non-citizen, national, or qualified alien, if there is a minor child in that household that meets that eligibility, then we will qualify that household based on that minor status. So if the parent or guardian is not a U.S. citizen and non-citizen, national, or qualified alien, but the minor child is, we will qualify that household based on the minor child's meeting that eligibility criteria. So we do try to make an effort to provide that assistance and be as flexible as we can while still meeting our legal requirements under the Welfare Reform Act. Now, the types of housing assistance that we provide. So under the Individuals and Households Program, the first type of assistance and the most common type of assistance is temporary housing. So when you have an applicant who is displaced from their primary residence, we can provide financial assistance, which essentially is rental assistance for someone to go and rent alternative accommodation. We provide an initial amount of 2 months rental assistance, and then after that 2 months, if the applicant still has a need, For continued assistance, we can provide continual rental assistance, and we typically provide that in slugs of 3 months worth of rental assistance. And within that as well is we do have the authority to pay security deposits. So we will also authorize security deposits under that financial assistance category. The next type of housing you will see is direct housing. So when we have a situation where an applicant cannot make use of rental assistance and there are no alternate housing resources available, that's when their housing stock has been really decimated and there's not enough housing available, then we may authorize a direct housing mission. And in doing so, that's when FEMA provides direct assistance. That's when we will provide a manufactured housing units. We just recently started authorizing recreational vehicles again after there were new standards put in place. We have what we call a multi-lease and repair program, which is where FEMA may repair existing multifamily dwellings and get them back online, and we will enter into agreements with property owners and lease those units for applicants. We also have the direct lease program where we may lease properties that aren't otherwise available to the public, corporate housing, corporate lodging, to try to get additional housing resources to applicants. Now, with respect to those forms of assistance, those are your most common forms of assistance for housing. Then we can move on to financial assistance. So additional financial assistance that FEMA provides, we will provide repair assistance. This is money to the homeowner to repair their damaged dwelling. We also provide, again, this type of assistance is not for renters, because the renter is not necessarily responsible for repairing an apartment building. So a renter is not going to get repair and replacement assistance. What a renter will be eligible for is financial assistance to rent another place, and something I'll talk in detail, personal property. If their personal property was damaged in their apartment, they would be eligible for personal property. Repair and replacement assistance, repair assistance, someone in a condo, for instance, they may be eligible for repair assistance for the inside walls into their unit. Repair assistance is allowable. Replacement assistance, there used to be a distinction between repair and replacement assistance. That distinction is really only, replacement assistance is for destroyed homes. There used to be a difference in that prior to PCMRA, or the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, we used to have caps, financial caps on repair and replacement. PCMRA removed those financial caps. So as a result, there's not much difference financially in terms of what you can receive. The difference really is replacement assistance is more for destroyed homes. Other programs we have that allow financial or direct assistance is permanent housing construction if it's authorized. There is a legal test for that. We don't authorize it that frequently, but when we do have to meet a legal test for that. And the other assistance is other necessary expenses, or what we call ONA. It's a catch-all for other necessary or serious needs that the applicant needs to meet. Now, as it relates to financial assistance, I want to highlight one thing. There is a financial cap. The financial cap for fiscal year 2017 was $33,300. I'm not sure. FY18 will probably be coming out, but anyway, we'll have at the end of this fiscal year in September, we will have another Federal Register notice that will tell you what the cap is. It's adjusted annually by the CPI. So that is the cap. So for rental assistance, repair assistance, replacement assistance, the total cap amount is $33,300. An applicant will get no more than that amount. For direct assistance, there is no financial cap because direct assistance is FEMA's program, and we're providing that direct service to the applicant. That is 100% federal assistance. there is no cap, no to the applicant or even to the state. It's 100% on FEMA. That temporary housing programs last for 18 months. That's statutory from the date of declaration, unless the president determines that the period of assistance needs to be extended. And that's the determination that's made from the White House down to FEMA. Now, going into repair and replacement assistance a bit more, once again, this is owner-occupied primary residence at the time of the disaster. We do allow some leeway for, let's say you have an applicant who literally was in their U-Haul truck moving to, to Louisiana or to Texas, and they're either en route or they're about to be en route. They've either purchased a home or they've leased an apartment. We have provisions that will allow us to pay that applicant assistance. They've not yet resided there, but it is they intend it to be their primary residence, and they've given up a residence somewhere else to relocate. In those instances, FEMA has circumstances where we will determine that is their primary residence and provide assistance. Now, generally speaking, repair and replacement assistance is to make the home safe, sanitary, and functioning. FEMA assistance, because we have a cap, the 33,300, is not intended to restore a home to its pre-disaster condition. FEMA assistance is only a part or a piece of the puzzle. It's not going to make an applicant whole. So if you have an entire destroyed home, 33,300 is not going to get you back where you needed to be, which is why we encourage people to have insurance. FEMA will get you on the road to recovery, but it's probably not going to meet all of your needs. With respect to an applicant's damage or loss, that FEMA inspection that I talked about earlier is the baseline for the calculation of the amount of assistance an applicant will get. We call it often the FEMA verified loss, or the FVL. And I will note that when our FEMA inspectors go out and inspect a home, we have line items that we record in terms of valuing the damage to someone's property. So if you had a $10,000 chandelier, you're not going to get that replaced. FEMA has we do use RS means, and we will provide you with, basic builder grade quality material. So, I mean, once again, because there's a cap, that inspection will determine how much assistance you get. And even if your inspection yields that your damage is $60,000, you're not going to get that from FEMA. You're only going to get the max grant, which is $33,300. Now, in addition to financial assistance to rent an alternative place to live, repair assistance or replacement assistance, we also have other needs assistance, and that's called ONA. Now, with ONA, FEMA works with the state on the eligible ONA items, and we also work with the state on the value for those items. Now, so you have two types of categories of assistance. You have SBA dependent and non-SBA dependent. So medical, dental, funeral, child care expenses. Child care was added after the Sanitary Recovery Improvement Act, SRIA. Those are non-SBA dependent. And the reason they are non-SBA dependent is because SBA does not provide a loan for those forms of assistance. So if you have medical expenses, dental, funeral, or child care, we don't perform a referral to SBA for a loan. FEMA will provide that assistance. However, for personal property, transportation, moving and storage, and we have a catch-all other necessary expenses, those are SBA dependent. And what will happen is when you apply for FEMA assistance, if it's that category, we will refer you to SBA. If you are not eligible for SBA loan because of income or anything else, you will come back to FEMA and we will provide assistance. And this assistance also counts against that 33,300 financial cap. Now, the reason we work with the states, on a state may say we are only going to pay $10,000 for a funeral, or we are only going to pay for transportation for a vehicle, for instance, up to $3,000. We work with the states because this is a cost share item for the state. So FEMA pays 75% of ONA, a state will pay 25% of ONA. So the state has a vested interest on the amount that goes to an applicant, and we work with them on that amount. I will tell you, a lot of this is work based on locality. So transportation in some areas is not going to be the same for others. So for instance, in Hurricane Sandy, we authorized the replacement of bicycles because a lot of people bike in New York, and that's their primary form of transportation. In Alaska, we authorized ATVs and snowmobiles because that is their form of transportation. So we try to be flexible with respect to the locale or with respect to the cultural considerations of a particular area. Even with respect to Native Americans, we try to be culturally sensitive to what the things that they need. So if they need certain types of structures, we try to make sure we work with the state to meet those requirements. Now, as it relates to all of you, applicant appeals is probably a big piece of what you would potentially do for an applicant. An applicant can appeal any FEMA determination. Their eligibility for assistance. So let's say there's an occupancy fail. They failed the occupancy test, but the applicant can demonstrate, well, I do have occupancy ownership, and they submit those documents. They can appeal. The applicant can appeal the amount of assistance. So that would include, not just the denial of assistance, but if they had a furnace and we provided them, let's say, $1,000 for the furnace, but that furnace actually costs $2,000 to repair. If they want to submit a contractor's receipt to demonstrate that this furnace is not operational and it needs to actually be replaced, and that replacement amount is $2,000, they can appeal the amount of assistance in additional assistance from FEMA. I would also say they can appeal recoupment decisions. And what a recoupment is if assistance was provided in error or obtained via fraudulent methods, or the amount was inappropriate, and they go into a recoupment situation. And recoupment is really FEMA seeking to recover funds from the applicant. They can appeal that decision. And we send very detailed letters and notices to applicants so that they know their rights and know their appeal rights. With respect to that, what I will say is the applicant should always file an appeal before it goes. You will have a letter from Individual Assistance Division. The next step in that process may be a letter from the FEMA Finance Center. As long as that issue is with FEMA, we can handle it. If the notices and appeals go ignored and we transfer that debt to Treasury, then Treasury has to handle it. And we don't have a lot of control once an applicant's debt is transferred to Treasury. So one thing I will emphasize is the applicant being responsive to our letters. Applicants can also appeal a denial of continued rental assistance or the termination of direct housing assistance. With respect to an appeal must be submitted, this is by statute and by regulation, within 60 days of the agency issuing the award or denial letter. All appeals must be in writing. It must explain the reason for the appeal, and it must be signed. Now, if a third party is appealing on behalf of the applicant, then that applicant has to authorize that appeal by that third party. And the reason for that is the applicant, when you're appealing, you're basically obtaining access to the applicant's file. Our files at FEMA contain a lot of what we call PII, or personally identifiable information. That is Social Security numbers, driver's license information, bank routing information, because our most common form of providing assistance to an applicant is via electronic funds transfer. So we will have that applicant's banking information. So in order for someone to access an applicant file, they need to get consent from the applicant so that we don't breach their privacy. How an appeal is filed. An appeal is handled. We have a specialized processing unit within our applicant services section that handles the appeal. OCC, or the Office of Chief Counsel within FEMA, does not handle the appeals. We may be consulted when there are legal questions. If there's counsel that's representing the applicant and for whatever reason they're having a hard time getting a copy of the file, we can certainly facilitate making sure you get a copy of a file or a status of an appeal, but we're not actually processing the appeals. We will only really coordinate and consult on, pure legal issues, but we're always here to help facilitate an appeal. And if there's something with an appeal decision that you have questions or concerns about, we're happy to engage and talk about those or link you to the appropriate program person that can help you with that appeal. So that's really OCC's level of involvement. With respect to an appeal, once an applicant's filed an appeal, FEMA's timeline for providing a written notice is 90 days. Via regulation, all appeal decisions are final. There are instances where we'll have a second appeal and we'll have to look at something else, and we will do that. But for all intents and purposes, our appeal decisions are typically final. If as a part of the appeal you need to file request an applicant's file. How you request a file, or let's say this is the applicant making a file request. That file request, we need the applicant's full name, date of birth, damaged dwelling, and we need the FEMA application number or social security number. In addition to that, the request has to be signed, and it either has to be one of three things: notarized, a copy of a government or state issued ID, or include a penalty. I hereby declare on a penalty of perjury that the foregoing is true and correct. That can be handwritten by the applicant. These requirements are not just FEMA requirements. These requirements are DHS regulations. So whenever we're releasing someone's file and it has personally identifiable information, DHS regulations require that we obtain these items before we release the file. If there's a third-party request, this may be a request from counsel or even an applicant who's, maybe elderly and they have their one of their children representing them and communicating with FEMA, or you have someone who has a power of attorney over applicant. When we have a third-party request, we require all of the same information, but we also require either a power of attorney or handwritten consent or statement saying, I consent to this person representing me, or letter of representation. Some attorneys, they combine the letter of representation and the consent all in one, so that we have the consent from the applicant and the letter of representation. Or if an applicant calls in on the phone and they have the third party on the line, they can consent over the phone to allow us to speak with them as well. And all of this, once again, is because we have personally identifiable information and we have an obligation under the Privacy Act and DHS regs to protect that information. I also included in the presentation, you can request a file or appeal in 3 different ways. An applicant can create an online account, and in that online account, they will get notices from FEMA, and they can upload their appeal and any supporting documents directly in their online account, or they can fax it to FEMA, or they can send it to our mail room within FEMA, and they'll process the appeal. There are occasions where appeals come my way, and I route them to the appropriate party within FEMA. that's a longer process. The most direct way is probably on the FEMA online account or faxing it in. And once we receive that appeal, it's scanned into what we call NEMIS. And NEMIS is our database system that has all the applicants' information and file in it. So that information is scanned into NEMIS, and then it's routed to our specialized processing unit. Lastly, I would say that you will find all of the legal authorities for individual assistance in Section 408 of the Stafford Act, and then 44 CFR Part 206, 110 through 120 are all of our implementing regulations. And then we also have all of our policy guidance that for each program and assistance. You will find that in the Individuals Household Program Unified Guidance. We are updating that. I do have a get back to, because we're updating our policies. And we do this frequently when we have, events and we realize maybe some of our policies need a bit more flexibility or a bit more clarity. So we're in the process of updating that, and it will be called the IAPPG, or the Individual Assistance Policy Program Guide. I think that's what that stands for. And I have a get back to let you all know when that's going to be final and published. So with that, I'll hand it off.
Hi. We're going to hold questions till the end, I understand. This is Sandra Brown from Lone Star Legal Aid, and the next PowerPoint is for this program. I'm going to make some general comments about being a pro bono attorney, what some of the best practices are, and the comments are going to relate to FEMA, our experience with dealing with that. So thanks for having me. As I said, I'm Sandra Brown with Lone Star Legal Aid in Houston, Texas, and my email will be listed at the end. And I'll be happy to answer questions today, and you can email me later if things come up. We're all in this together, and I think a lot of you have noticed it's getting to be more and more of a nationally integrated program, not just because we're dealing with national benefits like FEMA and the SBA, but also because our experience is always the same but different. And all of us are out there to help others do the best they can, not reinvent the wheel. And I'm going to talk about a tool to do that. It's the website that I am the content coordinator for. It's called disasterlegalaid.org. And we're going to talk about that as we go along. So Nathan, next slide. I'm talking to you from Farmville, Virginia. So he's helping me out, and he's my invisible hands. So we're going to talk about what you guys need to know. And one of the big things is the overview that you had for FEMA. You have to know about FEMA, about the SBA, what it does, how it helps you. And I'm going to give you some more specifics. So if you can go ahead, Nathan, next slide. So, lots. So on the disasterlegalaid.org webpage, we try to accumulate all of the state's disaster manuals, and we've got North Carolina's. Many states have a legal disaster manual that helps people answer frequently asked questions in a huge variety of legal areas. And I believe North Carolina is going to be working toward that kind of manual also in the future. One thing that does is it lets a tax attorney go out to a disaster recovery center and answer questions about landlord-tenant issues that they might not know. So one big point for an overview ahead of time, such as what we're doing.
What is that?
Is to, I'm getting background if you can mute your line. So one thing that disaster manuals can do is help people by letting people all volunteer and help out in the effort after a disaster. Now, North Carolina's current disaster manual, as I've mentioned, is up on disasterlegalaid.org. Just do a search for North Carolina or click through our manuals page, and you'll find it there. And what that does is give a lot of information about all the various benefits, federal, state, local, that people can access after disasters, specifically for North Carolina. So I just want to let you know that that's there, we update it, and what happens. One thing that people don't realize is how long the disaster recovery timeline is after disaster and how long pro bono attorneys can be helpful for. So immediately after a disaster, everybody wants to run to the DRCs and help, and that's very commendable. But I'd like people to keep on their radar that legal problems after disaster just change in character. They don't go away, at least not for a while. Next page, Nathan. Okay. So what happens first, and they mentioned that the disaster recovery centers are there. The legal aids and local bar associations are activated as part of the disaster legal services response. This is a FEMA program that's in conjunction with the American Bar Association, Young Lawyer Division, the Disaster Recovery Group. Each region will have one, so you can always look yours up. And you're activated as part of the unified response. If you're a legal aid LSC organization, you also have an MOU that will let you go to the American Red Cross shelters. But of course, especially at the shelters, this is the immediate aftermath, and people don't realize they have any legal problems yet, or they don't need to think about that. They're going to be thinking about more immediate things. So the most important thing you can do is go there and let them know you exist, what agencies you're with, get any kind of disaster flyer in these hands, in the people's hands, and then when they realize later they need some more specific legal help, they can get back to you. And as I mentioned, with the manual, you can talk about things that you normally don't cover, and the flyers that the local bar associations and legal aids prepare. And also, just so everybody knows, we have sample flyers on the disasterlegalaid.org webpage. Once again, it's a national effort to prevent people from having to reinvent the wheel. So legal aid and local bar associations could go there, look at the kinds of disaster flyers that have already been created, adapt them for your agency and your locale, and then take them with you to go out and respond. Just for example, I had sent Lone Star flyers, had gone to Moore, Oklahoma for the tornadoes. We'd sent some to Alabama. We'd sent some to American Samoa. So a lot of what we do, we don't need to duplicate other people's efforts, and that's part of what we do at disasterlegalaid.org. So there's some plain language flyers there too. Another important point is these flyers need to be straightforward and simple, so they're easy for people to understand. Go ahead to the next page. Okay, this is Maslow's, this is for the people that did psych undergrad, this is Maslow's needs. So when you first go out to the DRC, you're there, you're ready to help with legal issues, and not everybody wants to talk about you. They don't want to talk about a legal triage and see what they need. They're worried about their food, clothing, shelter, where they're going to stay, and what's happened to their house. So next slide, please. But the Maslow's psychological needs explains why they can't talk about legal issues, even if they have them, right away, and why it's so important for us to get the flyers into their hands. So they just need to deal with that first. There's been a lot of studies, and if anyone's interested, I'd put one site. After a disaster, these people are traumatized, and if they don't actually have post-traumatic stress disorder, they have something like it, because literally it's very akin to being shell-shocked. And the one I picked for you to look at was actually from the VA, and it's talking about war survivors being similar to disaster survivors. Obviously, no one's experience is the same as any one person's, and obviously some things are just way more severe on the continuum, but surviving a disaster, especially if you're personally impacted, has a similar effect, and it decreases people's ability to function, literally. Go ahead and give us the next slide, please. So here's another added problem that people just need to keep on their radar. Legal aid especially, we're dealing with people at or below, for us, 200% of the poverty level. So as I like to tell people, this gets us deep into the middle class. It's more than a mom and dad and 2 kids that each work in a minimum wage job. It's actually quite a bit above that. So this is the working dead level middle class. That's where legal aid can help. But the lower your income, the less ability you have to deal with things on an everyday basis. So if you are poor and suffer from a disaster, you're even more impacted, and it's very difficult to know what to do. It's very easy to become overwhelmed. And what do? We just be human beings. Be kind, get a flyer in their hand, tell them, I know you're dealing with more important things right now, but when you do have a problem, know that we're here to help you. And that's just, and ask them to take more flyers, give them to other people. The flyers are very low tech, but they're very helpful. And I tell people a lot of what we do, we go low tech and we go high tech. So we've got paper flyers that they can stick in their bag of resources, but we also are high tech because every state has something. In Texas, it's our lawhelp.org page. Each state has a platform where they keep resources for legal help, whether it's from your state bar, your legal aids. Everyone helps contribute to the state legal resource page. So most everything I talk about, there's a low-tech and a high-tech version. Next page, please. Okay. This one is sort of interesting. After Hurricane Harvey, I did 2 seminars with webinars, and if anybody wants to email me after, I mentioned the flood insurance here, but we had a different FEMA one, akin to the one presented by FEMA, but it was our points of what we saw dealing with FEMA. One thing that people don't understand is there's an interrelation between FEMA, the Small Business Association, and your insurance. Manir touched on that, but some things you have to apply to the SBA or you don't get more help from FEMA. The ONA is one of that. What's ONA again? She described that. But as a practical term, what that is transportation would be money to replace or repair your car that might have been damaged. And the other big thing is it helps people replace their personal property. If your home's been completely flooded or your home's been ripped off with a tornado and it's destroyed all your personal property, FEMA will help you get basic personal property to get started again. That's also what they call ONA. And if you meet their threshold test, if you're very low income, they don't refer you to the SBA. If you're more moderate, they'll refer you to the SBA. If they send you to the SBA, you do need to apply and take out a loan. And I jokingly tell people it's the only time in your life you're going to get rewarded for a worse credit score. They'll actually have a lower interest rate, people with more tenuous credit, let's call it, than someone who's more middle class. The idea is that if you can get credit elsewhere, you should. We personally were impacted by the last floods, and we realized we did what we're supposed to do. You apply to the SBA. And you tell people to apply to the SBA, and you might say, why? Because it keeps your options open. When it starts, unless there's an extension, your deadline to apply to the SBA is the same 60 days that you have to apply after the disaster declaration. If you miss this window, you've missed it permanently, forever. But you don't have to take the SBA loan, but you do have to apply while it's in the SBA application window. And as I said, it could be extended, just like the FEMA appeal deadline can be extended. But the easy thing is you just tell them it keeps your options open. If you would get denied by the SBA, they're going to send you back for FEMA for reprocessing, and FEMA could give you more money. But once again, it can't go over that cap. Now, what does your insurance have to do with this? Well, FEMA's there to support you in case there's some kind of delay with your insurance. There's 2 reasons you need to deal with your insurance companies right away. One, because you're obligated to tell them under your policy that you've had an impact event. But secondarily, for example, in Harvey, flood insurance that I had, for example, doesn't have displacement coverage, but my home insurance policy does. If I'm displaced from my home, that's going to provide rental assistance. So FEMA needed to know that my homeowners denied me. Now, I knew I didn't have a homeowners event. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't a hurricane or a tornado that took my roof off. I simply got flooded. But I needed to apply to my homeowners to be denied, to provide that to FEMA, so FEMA knew none of my insurance coverage was going to alternatively give me housing assistance. And then, as Manera said, FEMA then would give you some short-term rental assistance so you can regroup, figure out what you're doing. If you need more rental assistance, you can ask FEMA to extend it, but they'll also look about an SBA component for you. So if you've got an insurance delay, now flood insurance after Harvey was very unusual. They paid large advances quickly, and they did the adjusting without the completed proof of loss and got that money out. That was very unusual. But pretend, which has happened many, many times in the past, that you had a delay. If you had a delay, then what would happen is FEMA would then pay you for your advance on your insurance. Then when you settled with your insurance, you had to pay FEMA back. If there's a delay longer than 30 days, there's a policy that FEMA can advance you that money, which is very, very useful normally. So this is another way it helps people recover quickly. So that shortly is the interplay between FEMA, the SBA, and your insurance. So it's good that you have an overview and understand how they work together all the time. Next slide, please, Nathan. Okay, I had to do the quote. So we all know the song. I think it's going to be a long, long time. Well, it is. There's some studies out there, and they think that the recovery after a normal disaster on average is about 10 years. After Harvey hit, they started talking 15 years. And as I mentioned before, the legal problems just morph over time. So initially, the first legal problems that we see are FEMA applications and FEMA appeals and emergency landlord-tenant help with breaking leases, help with getting repairs if it's small damages and people might be able to move back in. One point I wanted to make about the FEMA applications, it can be helpful for the attorneys to even help people do their FEMA applications, pencil and paper. A lot of people don't understand the process, and they need help just understanding what the questions are talking about. We talked to an awful lot of people who flooded dramatically, who didn't know to ask for rental assistance right away. If you've had 3 or 4 or 5 feet of water in your house, I promise you, you won't be moving home in 1 or 2 months. It's going to be quite a while just to get your property dried out and do emergency repairs. So that's one thing. Another thing with regard to the appeals and FEMA, FEMA gets fairly quickly people that'll help case managers. And they were doing appeals, but and my sister agency, Trala, was having a bit of a problem with that. FEMA didn't understand why we couldn't just do FEMA appeals right there on the spot. If it's a really simple thing like submit a document that we need that you didn't have, I can understand that a FEMA appeal is easy. When it's an issue of proving ownership under FEMA CFR .208.111 definition of owner, now you're interpreting a code of federal regulations, so you can understand why it might take longer and need an attorney involved to make that kind of argument. And there's other situations that are similar to that. So it's very important that attorneys help every step of the way. They've been very beneficial helping people, even with the applications, especially with the appeals. Later on, as time moves on, time changes, legal problems change, and people need help with getting their leases broken because the landlords don't think they need to move out. We've had a lot of landlords that thought people shouldn't be in their apartment, should keep paying full rent while they had to go pay rent somewhere else. Getting repairs, or when your lease is broken, you are released or you break it yourself, getting your security deposits back. We had an awful lot of landlords who felt that they got to keep the damage deposit even though Harvey did the damage. Longer term, there's the community development block grants will come online. You're going to need title clearing work that some of us were talking about before. Suing fraudulent contractors is always a big problem. And I just put a note. We did a title clearing project after Ike that went from 2008 to 2017. Next slide, please. So here's the flyer that Tracy Figueroa from Trala, I worked on a little bit from Lone Star. This also had grown out of a presentation at the NLADA. So you should just know this is an example of all of us working together, being integrated. The more integrated all of us are, the better our response is for everybody. Next slide, please, Nathan. So this brings me to disasterlegalaid.org. And as I tell people, I've got a lot of hats and I answer to a lot of masters. This is another job that I do. I help work on the content from here. If you look at the bottom, you'll see we've got some good bona fides. It's the American Bar Association is a sponsor, Legal Services Corporation. Pro Bono Net is the platform, runs it. There is a fellow working with them right now, paid for by Pro Bono Net, that's doing an amazing job. National Legal Aid Defender Association. We're all here together supporting this webpage. This webpage is an outgrowth of the Katrina Legal Help webpage, and it got revamped in 2012. It's now mobile friendly. It's very useful on your phone. Next page, please. So if you go there, we have all sorts of resources for you. There's disaster training. There's a roundtable on recoupment that's going to be on the 30th. So you can go to the webpage and find that. If you just do the search for roundtable, you'll see the flyer and the information if you didn't already get it from the North Carolina Bar. Subjects you can look at. This is a very useful resource. It's set up for 3 audiences. The first audience is for individuals, and we've translated the first 3 landing pages into Spanish and Vietnamese. The middle section, it's color-coded. So the middle section, which is blue, is for the legal aid and nonprofit attorneys responding. The one that's green on the right is for the pro bono attorneys to respond and help. Next slide, please, Nathan. So Legal Services has disaster counseling videos that if you can get this PowerPoint sent to you later, you can link through or you can just find it. That's part of a Cargill grant that was given to Midwest legal aids to respond there. So much of this is national. You'll find many of these resources helpful. There was a FEMA appeals training by the New York City Bar. The first roundtable was pro tips for working with FEMA. There's always help from United Policyholders. The name sounds like a company, but I promise you this is a nonprofit. They always have help and they set up pages. We've got resources on all these other areas. Next one, Nathan. So they're now, I keep calling it disasterlegalaid.org because it's just a web page. If you write it down, I can tell you. It's better to call it the National Disaster Legal Aid Resource Center. It is at disasterlegalaid.org, but this is a national clearinghouse now with the roundtable, the resources. We're there for everybody. Flood insurance works very differently than regular homeowners insurance. So Martin Mayo volunteers a large amount of time with pro bono. He went with me to pre-train at all 3 of the law schools, law students. Now, although they're not going to be giving out advice at the DRCs, they want to know and understand, and then they're better prepared to point people in the right way, to hand out flyers. So they pre-trained on FEMA issues and flood insurance. There's 3 law schools in Houston, so this kind man went to all 3 law schools with me to pre-train. And then after Hurricane Harvey hit, I asked Martin if he'd go to Baker and Botts with me to do a training for the bar. And that training is now, this link I gave you is on the Texas Bar Disaster Resources page now. Martin kindly gave permission for me to use it and do his presentation. It's very comprehensive. And one point, if you, the big tip about flood insurance, if there's just 2 tips I give you, one, you have to understand about the proof of loss and get it in by the deadline. And the other one is that you need to understand that flood insurance is very different. And I just recommend that, and if anybody's dealing with it, this flood insurance PowerPoint's a good place to start. Next page, please, Nathan. Okay, best practices and tips. About the FEMA appeals, they tell you there's only one appeal, but I want everyone to notice that often you're denied for multiple reasons. Each one of those separate denials could be a separate appeal. Generally, we bundle them all in one appeal, but often people do not get these denials on the same date. And even though FEMA tells you and the CFR tells you that you only get one appeal, FEMA is very good at looking at new evidence, so you should appeal. And also, they specifically went out of their way to tell us that they are being very lenient on late appeals after Harvey because they knew how many people were impacted and how slammed it was. But if you have a good reason for a late appeal, they're always willing to hear that. Another big point is please call. Don't just file your appeal and wait for the 90 days. Please call and follow up. That gives you a chance to talk to people and make sure that they didn't misunderstand something in your written appeal. And if you're dealing with rental assistance, there's a special team that does that. You can ask for that team because people do have to recertify and requalify. And those are 2 of the big tips. And also one thing, when you're dealing with people that come to you with one legal problem, there have been a lot of studies that show that they don't really have the one legal problem they present with, that they actually have 7. So if you can do a general legal checkup, find out if they've got other legal problems. Case managers, for example, we found didn't realize that an eviction was a legal problem. And that's something that we do. And on the bottom line, we're almost a year past Harvey now. And I just want to brag at my team, on my team, and it gives you an example. Just one group, which is about 7 attorneys right now, did $188,000 worth of recovery just in 3 months. We're winning an awful lot of FEMA appeals. We're getting more money for a lot of people. We're taking a lot of people denied completely and getting them very large recoveries. And another issue we found is insurance settlements, especially with HOAs. We found out that sometimes these people keep, let's just say, more of the insurance proceeds than they should. So that's another area you might be looking at. People with condos and HOAs, if it seems like they're getting offered a low amount of money, that's something. And as always, contractor fraud, often very difficult to recover on. But we have been having some success with that. And I'm very proud of that group that I work with. We've got people in a lot of different offices, but the main concentration was in our Houston office of the damage and of the lawyers. And it's still a year out, so we were winning a lot of FEMA appeals early on, but even this late, we're still hearing back and still making recovery. Next page, please. Okay, we said questions at the end, and I think the next slide will just put up my contact information. So anyone can email me there, and I'll try to get back to you fast as I can individually. So I think we're at the question moment.
I had one question come in via email that I'm going to go ahead and ask, and I think it's for Manira.
Sure.
So the question was, are qualified aliens described in the citations on slide number 6? Maybe that's self-evident, but I think we'd appreciate a little clarification on what qualified aliens are for FEMA purposes.
Okay, so with respect to immigration status, we will always advise someone, to consult an immigration attorney. However, with respect to qualified aliens, we do have a list in the IHP Unified Guidance, which I am going to try to pull up because I do not remember all of the categories off of the top of my head, but we do for qualified aliens. If you go in the IHP Unified Guidance, it's legal permanent residents, an asylee, a refugee, or an alien whose deportation is being withheld, an alien paroled to U.S. for at least 1 year, alien granted conditional entry per the law in effect prior to April 1st, 1980, a Cuban or Haitian entrant, aliens in the U.S. who have been abused, subject to battery or extreme cruelty by a spouse or other family or household member, or who have been a victim of severe form of human trafficking, and aliens whose children have been abused, and alien children whose parents have been abused who fit the certain criteria. So we follow USCIS's criteria, and if an applicant has a question about whether or not they're a qualified alien or non-citizen national, we always recommend they consult with the immigration attorney.
Nathan, if I can add one comment. Under the act that Manira mentioned before, there's a proposal through the OMB to change the rules so that anyone that does apply for FEMA benefits in the future, the parents would be ineligible for adjustment of status. What's going on right now is you get a pro rata share based upon, let's say, 2 undocumented adults, 2 citizen children. You apply to FEMA as a co-applicant with one of the citizen children, and then you get 50% of the rental allowable allowance because 50% of the household would have been eligible. But that is one thing that's getting a lot of comments that I believe there's definitely a lot of comments about changing the Welfare Act to make that change, because that would mean families with citizen children would no longer, or at least that they would consider not applying because it would have that impact in the future. But as I said, this is just a proposed rule change at this point, and you can Google that and get more information.
That's good stuff. Guys, if you have any other questions, please go ahead and ask them now through the questions pane on the webinar software, or you can use the chat function to ask them to me and we'll read them out. I did get one question about if the materials would be made available to the attendees, and yes, we will definitely be sending both of these PowerPoints out to everyone that registered after the presentation today. Do we have any more questions? Go ahead and send those in now, y'all. Okay, so I think I can answer this one that just came in about seeking CLE credit. If you are a North Carolina licensed attorney, we're going to be, we're going to be submitting the CLE credit for you directly to the North Carolina State Bar. If you are a out-of-state attorney, out of North Carolina attorney, we're going to be emailing you a certificate of attendance that you can furnish to the bar in your own state. All right, we've got a couple more questions coming in. Just to recap, what is the best way for volunteers to assist, or I'm sorry, let me start over. Do you think the best way for volunteers to assist is to prepare the FEMA applications up front or to help with the appeals afterwards?
I'd say both, depending on the person. They found it very useful to go over it, and we have found that people did have difficulty understanding the questions. The easiest way to apply, as Manera mentioned, is online. People are doing the appeals online, and that's fine and well, except we had noted that, that just reminded me of something else. We had noted that FEMA couldn't see documents uploaded, so we're following up by always faxing in appeals and appeals documents also. So for us, the largest thing we were doing was appeals. There was another program that they were doing the initial applications much more extensively. Some people don't need any help, obviously. Some people do. You're just dealing with clients on an individual basis. But we had found it very useful for some, so we wanted to make sure you knew that that in and of itself was something that attorneys could help with. And we had noticed that sometimes it was just, they didn't realize they needed rental help. But with 5 feet of water, you're not moving back in a month or two. So that was just an example. So the answer is truly both, and take each person as an individual, of course, as you always do. Which reminds me, one other thing, there is a FEMA Appeals Bank. If you join the National Disaster Legal Resource Center, we do have, in addition to the flyers, FEMA Appeals Banks for frequently seen issues. And obviously each appeal, each case is different, but it's a good jumping off point, and we're trying to help people not reinvent the wheel.
All right, that's very helpful. We had another question come in about the reference earlier to community development block grants. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and how that could potentially assist disaster victims?
Okay. A couple of points. As part of the arc of the disaster recovery that we've clearly gotten way too familiar with, first online comes FEMA, the SBA, the nonprofits. And in Houston, we got a lot of local donations, and we started the home repair with our local nonprofits. And if you'll look at some of FEMA's documents about the sequence of delivery, this is all anticipated. It was never anticipated that FEMA or SBA be the only way to recover. Further down the road, FEMA funds money through HUD that then goes to the state, and the state then sends to the local governmental or council of governmental agencies. This is the Community Development Block Grant Program. Many of you might be more familiar with them for doing projects such as, urban renewal maybe. But they also have a disaster recovery component. And when we say CDBG DR, these are a way that further recovery can happen. But because of the, there's actually a bill floating through now talking about a way to make them be to be implemented faster. But as of right now, each one has to be implemented separately for each disaster. Manera mentioned the FEMA verified loss. Adding up that loss is part of how they decide how much they need for a community development block grant. And the short answer is there's never enough money to fund them completely. Just to give you an example, even based upon the FEMA verified loss in the 2015 floods, by the time we got to the community development block grants, that was only able to help 10% of the need. In other words, 90% didn't get help from these block grants, and they're geared to go to low and moderate income people. They also can cover infrastructure. That was an issue in Mississippi after Katrina. The state was going to use it for a giant infrastructure rather than go to housing.
There was a lawsuit and it was redirected to housing. So one about the community development block grants, the legal aid programs, we don't advocate, we don't do policy, we can't lobby. But one issue that other groups are interested in and talk about is the actual need. Just as an example, after Harvey, half the people that applied were denied. And as I mentioned, we won a lot of appeals. So that does show you that many of the people denied were not done so correctly. So when you only count the FEMA verified loss, it's undercounting the actual need. But this is a program. It is local. They want everything to be as local as it can. So the state will make a plan, and then the local government will make their plan, and then that will tell you who can apply, who would be eligible, how to apply, and what the appeal process is. That is an area of law that we help people with and have been doing for years. And when that comes online, it doesn't always come online for every disaster. But if and when it does, that's another area that pro bono attorneys, legal aid attorneys, local bar associations can mobilize people, state bar, to help individuals navigate that process.
Gotcha. I've got a couple more questions we're going to go through. I think this one I can go ahead and answer. If there is a disaster, does Legal Aid of North Carolina typically put together programs to train attorneys on helping victims? I feel confident saying the answer to this is yes. We've done a series of CLEs and non-CLE trainings over the last several years since Matthew hit. I believe to train volunteers, I would recommend everyone keep an eye on our CLE calendar on the Legal Aid of North Carolina website, which is legalaidnc.org. And we'll also be doing email blasts and other publicity on our social media as well. So keep an eye out for that as soon as the next disaster hits our state, and we'll be doing trainings as up to the minute as we can. All right, the next question is there a typical clearinghouse for smaller local assistance efforts or funds like churches or other organizations?
Generally, you'd contact your local long-term recovery group. I was the chair of the VOAD in Houston 2 years ago when 15 hit. So there's voluntary organizations active in disaster. That's a national organization that has a state organization, often has local ones. It's sort of a conglomeration and loose association of all the nonprofits that are going to respond and help people after disaster. But one thing that happens is the governmental agencies and FEMA can only give information to certain people. And one of those groups would be your long-term recovery committee. And I've been involved in those, going back to Katrina. And I've helped set them up in other areas of Texas. So the Long-Term Recovery Committee is an association of the churches, the local government people, who's going to respond and what we're doing with what funds we raise, and they can make plans that way. So right now for Houston, just as an example, we're accessing recovery funds for different areas, counseling, legal, rebuilding, through the United Way is who mainly convenes our long-term recovery committee. So each area can do it their own way. It's their long-term recovery committee. They own it, and they have to decide how it works. Just another example, we had really bad flooding in 15 and 16, and what we call our Golden Triangle, it's Belmont-Port Arthur area. 3 counties banded together and made their own local long-term recovery group, but they decided that the funding raised, if it was raised in one county, it would only be spent in that county, and that's how they resolved it. So it'll be different where you are, but you should always look for a local VOAD and a local long-term recovery committee. That's who you contact.
And I'll just chime in and say that in North Carolina, our local areas do have both of those groups who are many of whom are still active after Matthew to this day. We also have a disaster recovery group that meets at the NC Rural Center in Raleigh regularly that pulls those groups together. And I believe if you get on the NC Rural Center's webpage, there is a list of local groups. There's also a list you can find at through NC Emergency Management that lists all of those BOAD groups. So that might be a helpful place to look.
Excellent. So the next question we got was, how did the SBA get into the disaster relief business?
I don't know how they got into it, but they are actually the largest financial vehicle for disaster recovery. So my joke about that is they should be, you know, not the Small Business Administration, but the Disaster Recovery and Small Business Administration. Their name's sort of a misnomer. You know, they've got one set of limits for the houses. I think it's up to 200. They've got up to $500,000 for businesses. And that's another reason it's really important. The statistics of small businesses that have been impacted that go under are really, really pretty alarming. I won't give you a percentage because I'm not 100% sure on it, but it's really a high percentage. I found it very alarming when I saw it. But they've been the vehicle as long as I've been doing disaster recovery work, but honestly, I don't know how long they've been doing that. Maybe Manura knows.
I can't speak to how long they've been doing disaster recovery, but it's been a very long time. It even predates the current IHP program, which used to be the Individual and Family Grants Program. SBA has their own authorizing statute. So what a lot of people don't even know is if FEMA doesn't declare a disaster, SBA has independent authority and they may declare a disaster. So there may be a disaster where FEMA doesn't show up for a variety of reasons and we've not declared it, but SBA will. And we coordinate a lot with SBA, and if SBA, we're in the process of, normally FEMA goes out first and then SBA, but in situations where SBA gets out ahead of us, we're developing a sequence of delivery in that circumstances where SBA gets out ahead of us. So SBA is a big player in disaster recovery.
Well, that is a fascinating little window into the government. So the next question we had was, and I don't know if this is something you all would be able to answer for sure, but you might have some insight into it, was, does the American Red Cross allow area designations for contributions or donations? For instance, I want to give $1,000 to the Red Cross, but I want it applied to aid in Eastern North Carolina for disaster victims there.
I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not sure. We coordinate with Red Cross nationally. I'm not sure how they designate. If they do designations locally, they may. I can't really answer that question either.
Fair enough. The next question we had, and I think this comes up a lot in North Carolina, especially with some of the voter ID laws, was what if a person that is applying for disaster relief assistance does not have a photo identification?
So let me, going into identity verification, there are methods in which we use to identify individuals. So if they have a social security number, we can do identity verification. We have an agreement with LexisNexis that can do identity verification based on social security number. If they don't have a picture ID, we will try to make exceptions and work with that applicant and see what they do have. But we have a lot of electronic verification measures that we use behind the scenes when applicants can't produce documents. But normally those are one-offs and case-by-cases, and we try to work with the applicant to figure out something, even if it's a replacement ID. But we rarely run into that.
All right. I've got one last question here, and if anybody has any more, please go ahead and run through now. But the last question we had on the docket was, what are some of the most common reasons why grant or assistance applications are rejected?
Do you want to take that one first, or do you want me to take it?
Go ahead, Manira. I saw the statistics, but you see them way more often than I do. Jump in. Tell them why they're denied for FEMA.
Why they're denied from FEMA? We will have challenges most often with eligibility criteria, and that would probably be maybe occupancy ownership. That's one, but that can be overcome. Another common reason may be that trying to think why they wouldn't normally be eligible. Insurance.
Insufficient, right. Insufficient damage is the one that trended highest after Harvey.
Definitely, yes.
And there used to be a lot of issues, deferred maintenance. FEMA got sued by our buddies down in the Valley, and over the Lupe case, if anyone's interested in that, it was the main contention was FEMA wasn't transparent with policies, and people were being denied, being told deferred maintenance. So poor people don't have enough money to maintain their homes. When the disaster would come, it's going to impact it a lot worse. So the CFR was actually changed after that to strengthen and beef up the language, where it said FEMA pays for the damage caused by that specific disaster declaration disaster. And that appeared to be a direct outgrowth of the Lupe case. So we're still seeing some of that. They do not say deferred maintenance generally now. They just say insufficient damage, and it doesn't give you a lot of explanation. The FEMA denials now have more information, a longer explanation of this is the denial, and this is what you need to overcome the denial. But the insufficient damage is the highest listed one after Harvey. And I looked at it through Florida, Puerto Rico. It looks to be that was the largest denial for most of them. And as I said, just the fact that we're winning appeals and the amount of money that we're winning show that that's not always a correct decision, and that's why the appeal process exists. Also, we had a lot of problems with ownership until we were able to get FEMA to accept Texas's affidavit of heirship. In Texas, when someone dies, you own the property immediately that came from your ancestor. So FEMA's looking for proof that you owned it before. So we've now gotten that straightened out. Puerto Rico's able to, they've gotten an affidavit about ownership approved by FEMA, and there's a trend that other states are doing that. FEMA wants to help the people that are eligible. It's often just a disagreement of their definitions as substantially damaged, uninhabitable, and owner. And that's a lot of what we appeal.
Very interesting. So the last question we had was, and I think this probably goes for both of you, was, in your experience, are there any noteworthy gaps that are frequently encountered in providing meaningful relief for disaster victims? In other words, what do we not do very well in this effort?
Do you want me to fill that first, or?
Go for it.
Yeah, sure.
From the FEMA side, one of the things you're on the FEMA side, because our assistance is so limited, you're always going to see that gap in terms of what someone actually needs to recover versus what FEMA can provide. So, I mean, our assistance is limited. So you're not going to see someone recover 100% from FEMA. What we need to do better on FEMA side is streamlining and simplifying the process for applicants. Sometimes, our processes need to be streamlined so that it's easily understandable for an applicant when they apply, that our letters are clear, and applicants can understand easily our letters. So we've done letter writing campaigns. Even she mentioned the Lupe case that required us to further clarify our regulations. So on the FEMA side, what we can do better is more transparency and more simplification of our process. Prior to the IHP Unified Guidance, our policies were not public. And so an applicant is at a disservice when they don't know the policies or procedures, or even our stakeholders, even attorneys. So you're trying to navigate an appeal, and we have a policy that's not necessarily public. So that was our first effort of making all of our IA policies public, and we're continuously trying to improve that. So I would say, what don't we do well? Simplification, and that is one of our strategic priorities for this administration, is simplifying the IA process across the board for applicants, the inspection process, making that easier, trying to find ways, innovative ways to make it simpler. We're using GIS data now. We don't necessarily, for all of the 2017 disasters, we didn't have to do a lot of on-site inspections. We can use GIS data and flood mapping data to see that someone's home is inundated with floodwater and floodwater depths, and we don't need to do. We can tell you you're going to get a max grant, your home's destroyed. So on our side, those are some of the things that FEMA's really focused on this year as priorities.
One problem we saw a lot, FEMA has a script that the inspectors use, for example, and the questions being so important, I mentioned that some people are well served by having an attorney help them do the application. If you put down on the FEMA application amount of damages unknown, because you didn't know if you had 10,000, 50,000, or 100,000, you'll get an automatic denial. You can't say unknown. You have to put in an amount. So we would tell people, just guess what an expensive contractor would charge you. So that's an example of the rigidity that is causing, let's call them false denials. And another example is FEMA sends out a bulletin that tells you the inspector does not determine your eligibility. Well, technically that's true, but in another example, it's not. A FEMA employee themselves were very unhappy that the FEMA inspectors are taught to ask, are you willing to move? Well, they don't say, are you willing to move short term so that your property can be repaired? So if a nice person says, well, I don't want to move, I like my house, I like my neighborhood, I want to stay here, you're automatically denied. And that's another example of an appeal that we have to do that we shouldn't have to do. So FEMA is in the process of redoing their scripts right now, and I hope that they'll be improved. But because they're dealing with a lot of applicants and a lot of people, and they had to train a lot of inspectors quickly, I understand why they needed to ask for the rigidity in the questions and how they're answered, but it's caused some other unintended problems, let's say. And I just preferred if every question FEMA asked on the application or through the inspector was so clear that it wouldn't lead to a false denial that then is going to be appealed and overcome. And one comment I always made is, well, we won all these ones we got, but what about the thousands and thousands of other people that didn't get to legal aid or a pro bono attorney? And that's probably one of my biggest takeaways on the whole process. And I mean, I understand none of us have a magic wand.
Those are some great responses. I think we are out of questions now and out of time. Leslie, do you want to wrap us up?
I just want to thank you all so much for attending, and we'll get the materials out to you. And thanks to Nathan and Cherie for arranging everything today. We hope you join us again.
Yes, we're happy to help, and please make sure to indicate your interest in volunteering with Legal Aid of North Carolina on these type of cases if you are a North Carolina-based attorney. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.